right, well, I'm going to back up a little bit and do my thanks to Professor Ahmed Farouk for inviting me here, and for the IR Front for organizing this and hosting. I guess I'm getting confused about who the host is. There was one host and then there was another host. So now my understanding is that the new host is the Faculty of Law here at the University of Malaya and the Penang Institute, and I appreciate that very much. This is, and by the way, I want to thank some friends and colleagues who I see here who I remember from a year ago, and so it's nice to be back. I was just talking with Dr. Ahmed Farouk last night and observing the fact that when I was here in 2012-13 during the academic year, I was fascinated by the politics of the time. There was an election coming up, and so everything seemed to be flowing out into the press. And what's interesting is I come back 2 years later and some of the same issues are flowing back into the press. It just seems like, it reminds me very much of American politics, that some things never get resolved. They just keep reappearing. In any case, I think it's important to say that it's almost impossible to imagine a more pressing and kind of dangerous geopolitical issue or situation than the one that this roundtable discussion is going to focus on today. Perhaps at no other time since 9/11 has the world's attention been focused on religious terrorism, on the threat of Muslim extremism. And rightly so. I don't want to necessarily entertain you with a number of slides on this issue. You have all been following this in the news over the last several months. And for those of you who have been watching very carefully the news over the last 24 hours, you know there are even more events that have been taking place. What's, I think, fascinating about all of this is the extent to which the new global terrorism is coming in a kind of high-tech, high-resolution, very entertaining, almost impossible not to watch, very ritualized actions, and of course very deadly ones. It's almost impossible not to participate virtually in this, and I think that's the entire part of this. It's almost, it's so well stagecraft. Very rarely have any of us, I think, seen terrorists who are so technologically savvy. And the impact is drawing us all in, and it's also frightening people, and it's, what I think is fascinating about it also is the fact that it's drawing people in both out of fear, but also in its attempt to entice the West, especially Western nations, but also regional countries, to draw them in so they will participate and to kind of multiply the chaos. And from what I can tell, it seems to be working quite well. We seem to be following a script, and we aren't the ones who have written it. How this is all going to play out is difficult to say. Coalition forces are currently, of course, at work trying to trying to cut back on the IS's ability to operate in Syria and Iraq, and they seem to be having some success. Although now it seems to be spreading, metastasizing to other regions when it's going to be very difficult to control this. But I think one thing seems to be clear, that even if IS were eliminated tomorrow, the fundamental problems that underlying the causes of religious terrorism and the frustrations that seem to be feeding into it, these things aren't going to go away. They're still going to be there because in the Middle East, it seems to be caught up in a cycle of failed politics, failing states, and this seems to be intractable. And unfortunately, I have to say that the West is up to its eyeballs in this. I mean, the West is part and parcel of this. This is truly a geopolitical problem. It's not something that's confined to the Middle East any longer. And if we need any more indications of this, by the way, this is from the incident that just happened in Tunisia, the museum that was attacked. We were seeing this quite often, the memorials set up by people for the dead. These are the images that just occurred yesterday in the Yemen, the 2 mosque bombings that occurred. It's kind of amazing, and we can see this in a kind of map schematic of the various jihadist areas that are now peppering the area. It's it's frightening to think about how all this is coming about, and the kind of the extent of it throughout the Middle East. I'm going to quote something here. I typically don't do this to quote a theorist, especially since we've just had the introduction that told us to avoid theory. But one of the basic, I think, underlying ideas of modern state formation was coined by Max Weber in his essay called Politics as a Vocation, in which he said a modern state is essentially a human community that successfully claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory. That is, the italics are in the original, by the way. This is a kind of a standard understanding of the modern state, and perhaps it's rather crude practical politics of the use of force. But one of the things I find useful about this understanding is that there's a couple of things going on with it that help us, I think, see what's going on in the Middle East. And just to back up to the photograph here of the map, is that what we do have are states that are clearly not able to successfully claim the legitimate use of violence in their areas. We have essentially states that have that are under siege, and their governments are not able to control the sovereignty of the country. And even many of those states that are able to do this in the Middle East do not have legitimacy. The governments have not been put in place by any kind of mandate of the people, and this has been going on since the mid part of the 20th century. We have authoritarian governments, and it doesn't seem to be going away. One of the ways in which this gets drawn into a larger political context without even talking about Western intervention is to look at the number of Western Muslims who are traveling to Iraq and Syria now to participate in the violence. I can tell you that this is sending shockwaves through many of the Muslim communities in the US, wondering what's going on. Why are people who are seemingly well-educated, who have come from good families, why are their children up and leaving, sneaking off, and then traveling to Turkey and then into Syria? And we see images of Western Muslims, in some cases recent converts, who now are proudly putting on these uniforms and becoming essentially terrorists. And the young women who are leaving also, who are to become either brides or to become in some way to assist in IS in a variety of ways. And it's kind of strange. And then we have the other part of this, which if it's not the people who are leaving, it's the terrorism that's arising in the West itself, in Europe and the United States. And the kind of incident that happened in France, and not surprisingly, the European response to this, and I'd have to say the response in America, which is typical, is to see that there is something wrong, of course, with the Islamic world in general, with Muslims in particular, with Islam, that this is not a political problem as much as it is a cultural problem. And the response in many cases in Europe is to try to curtail immigration and to suggest that somehow Muslim leaders, Muslim religious leaders in particular, need to be preaching and teaching against violence as if this hasn't been happening for decades to begin with. I mean, it's been going on for a long time. But I think part of the problem is that if Muslims aren't knocking on doors in the West and telling people that they're rejecting the violence, I think many people in the West don't seem to hear it. It's not that people understand the language of the Muslim world. It doesn't appear in print. If Thomas Friedman doesn't get the message, then it seems like America and the West doesn't get the message in general. It's kind of disturbing that this is the case. And what is, I guess, most troubling in some ways is that, and I don't think the people in the West understand the extent to which the states in the region are really kind of reacting in a way that, or the people in the area are reacting in a way that does draw out understandings of Islam, but Islam that is more or less, I think, in some sense coded, or it's a symbolic message. It's not Islam as a religion, it's Islam as a kind of assertion of political identity and identity formation. I think the root cause of this, in my opinion, is that too many states in the region are unable to meet the economic and social needs of their citizens. Too many states engage in crony capitalism, empowering an elite minority at the expense of the majority. Too many states are authoritarian, with elaborate security services dominating civil society and silencing the political opposition. Too many states engage in sectarian Muslim politics that jeopardizes the safety and rights of ethnic and religious minorities. The religious terrorism now eating away at the fabric of modern nations is both a product and a sign of this situation. ISIS and other jihadist groups are threatening the nation states in the region, taking advantage of people's frustration and anger at central governments, but they are also playing off anger at Western powers and the impact of their foreign policies that they've had in the Middle East and beyond. So like no other time, the geopolitics of the Middle East is intertwined with global stability and security, and like at no other time, the problem of religious terrorism is a global problem. And I'm going to skip over some of this because I think we're going to have, I wasn't sure how much time I would have here today, but. Well, I don't want to, I think the format here is probably better geared to a discussion than it is a kind of PowerPoint lecture, but just to make some clear points, from my perspective, the way I see the emergence of ISIS, and the kind of global jihadist problem that has emerged, is that this is rooted actually in the Islamist politics of the Middle East, both moderate and militant Islamist politics. I think everyone knows the kind of the history of Al-Qaeda, and the issues of how this arose. But let me just say that I follow one of the writings. I don't know if some of you might have read Faisal Devji's work on this, and I think it's true to say that Islamism and Islamist militancy and global jihadism, it goes global as a result of a kind of failure of nation-state politics in the Middle East. In other words, if there had been some way to accommodate within Arab countries the Islamist protest, Islamist politics, if there would have been some way to try to bring them into the fold, number one, I don't think we would see the kind of militancy that gradually emerged. And interestingly enough, I think what winds up happening is that the jihad that occurred in nation states by a variety of spin-off groups from, say, the Muslim Brotherhood, that this kind of militancy winds up going global because it could not figure out a way to transform the nation states in the Middle East because they were so security conscious and the state and the military was in such firm control that there was no way to transform the politics of nation states. So they wind up going to what becomes one of the chaotic regions of the world, Afghanistan, chaos that is also caught up with the geopolitics of competition between Western powers, and they wind up planting themselves here and creating a place from which to operate. And it's this kind of chaotic environment of a failed state of Afghanistan that winds up being the kind of breeding ground for this kind of global jihadism. And the danger of this, of course, is that the activities of jihadists in this kind of global context are not rooted in the transformative potential of nation-state politics. In other words, they're not really operating towards a specific nation-state end where they're trying to improve the lives of a particular group of people, where people are petitioning them to help them, with practical issues of economics. Once this jihadist mentality kind of gets itself removed from a nationalist setting and goes global, it has no responsibility to people anymore. It has more of a responsibility to ideology and to what some people would call a kind of values and morality that's floating above and beyond the nation state and is not rooted in any kind of practical politics. And this makes it very, very dangerous. From my perspective, for the most part, Al-Qaeda was never interested in, even in the Palestinians, it was never interested in a lot of these kinds of issues. It was using these issues as kind of instruments and tools to suggest a connection to the actual real-world Muslim experience, but they weren't interested in really resolving these problems at all. What they were interested in doing is fomenting more and more chaos on a kind of global level, and hopefully in some strange scenario, create some kind of transformative politics that went beyond what they considered to be the nation states, because in large part the nation states had failed them. So in that sense, the jihad went global because authoritarian politics within states would not allow Islamists a real place at the table. And in this sense, the kind of cosmic war that is partly the backdrop to some of this, to the roundtable today, I think is a kind of refuge for those who have given up on politics or are trying to impact the world of nation states in a kind of different way. And what's really strange about this, I know some of you have probably noticed this, there's kind of a schizophrenia involved with the way IS is operating, advertising to draw Muslims in from around the world, promising them, looking for people who are professionals who can bring professional status and professional aid to help create a state, and at the same time what they're asking them to do is to come and be martyrs. So they're, at the same time that they're suggesting that come, we'll give you an apartment, we'll give you a wife, we'll provide you with all your needs, and by the way, the end time is coming, and let's prepare for the apocalypse. So it's this kind of schizophrenia that I find rather troubling. On the one hand, it's behaving like it wants to be a state, but on the other hand, at the same time, it's essentially saying the end time is upon us, so why would one want to care about creating a state to begin with? But there it is. That seems to be, and what's even scarier, I suppose, is how many people are in fact attracted to this and have found this somewhat appealing in some way. Now, of course, it's hard to not talk about the fact that it's Western nations that have supported these authoritarian leaders in the Middle East, because they were often seen as allies who were fighting against extremists and keeping the region sufficiently stable to maintain the flow of oil, and of course to maintain some kind of peace with Israel. The Western reaction to global jihad wound up, I think, contributing to the very kind of chaos on which groups like ISIS feed. Western intervention in Afghanistan and then Iraq disrupted traditional political arrangements, led to civil strife, if not civil war, and undermined economic stability. Once these missions were deemed successful or successful enough, the West pulled out and left the newly created chaos to local actors who were no better prepared to give shape to inclusive societies than their predecessors. And not surprisingly, the anti-Western sentiment of locals has grown the greater ever since that. One of the things that probably a good example of this is once the U.S. pulls out of Iraq after they had the elections, an election that probably should have never taken place, by the way, at least in my opinion, shouldn't have taken place. I think this has been the problem in both Iraq and Egypt. Both of these countries pushed so quickly towards elections, I think often at the behest of the West, seemingly thinking that democracy and elections was going to be the transformative sign that things have gotten better. But the reality is that there's really no open political culture in these societies to begin with. People aren't used to dealing with each other honestly. They aren't interested in the give and take of politics. And so it was kind of a winner-take-all battle. And not surprisingly, in a place like Iraq, what happens is, out of just sheer numbers, the Shia take over and see this as a kind of opportunity to reclaim power and to take revenge on the Sunni who were oppressing them for so many years under Saddam Hussein. And inclusive politics went out the door. The Sunnis were merely pushed out, and there was no opportunity to try to bring them in. So instead of trying to build some kind of coalition government from the start and then working towards elections, instead you move right towards elections. And this is where actually democracy often does not work. When you have clear majorities that are not going to be very open towards their people who have been their enemies for decades, right? And this was also the problem in Egypt. It shouldn't have been too surprising that post-Arab Spring, that the Society of Muslim Brothers was the only group that was politically well organized enough to actually win elections. They had outposts throughout the country. They had offices. They had support. Everyone knew essentially they were going to win if there was going to be free and fair elections, and they do wind up winning. And not surprisingly also, the Muslim Brotherhood, for all its claims to want democracy and want to come into power this way, is also not used to being inclusive. It's not used to sharing power. It's not used to ever having power. It was always held out of power by the Egyptian state. So when it did come into power, it tried to control as much as possible, just like previous regimes did. And this was more or less giving a pretext to the military to step back in. I think there was one hopeful sign, 4 years ago with the Arab Spring that I think so many of us, this is a picture from Tahrir Square, that so many of us thought that the Arab politics was going to shift and change. And of course, it did shift and change in many ways. So many leaders were either pushed out of power or at least they lost control of their countries. 4 years later, of course, things are actually no better off, and in fact, in some cases, one might argue they are worse off than they were before. It's a recent map of the area. Governments overthrown in black. Interestingly enough, Egypt twice. 2 governments overthrown, and the most recent one is the only democratically elected government that was overthrown. Libya is in chaos. Tunisia is in chaos. Yemen is in chaos. So all of these all these governments that were in some way changed as a result of the Arab Spring, they have all fallen back into their previous patterns, all except Tunisia. And that was one hopeful sign, and still is, I think, which is probably no doubt why it has just recently been targeted. I think the targeting is to try to go out one of the countries that seemingly from the Arab Spring was able to make some positive steps. But if you look at this very map, the map of what happened post-Arab Spring, and you look at it today, you see that there are, democratic facades in most countries, or there is a failing state or civil war. I think the red area where you see ISIS in control in Syria and Iraq, I think you could actually probably put Libya in red right now, and maybe Yemen in red too. They're pretty much there's civil war in these countries too. It's a very sad and depressing state of affairs, and it doesn't seem to be getting any better. Primarily because most of these countries that have fallen back into previous authoritarian ways are trying to deal with the religious extremism in the same way that the West deals with the region, and that is in terms of counterterrorism strategy. This is all having to do with security issues as far as the states are concerned, gaining control, and or from the U.S. perspective, trying to tamp down the extremism so it doesn't spread. And no one seems to be concerned very much about the internal politics of these countries and the fact that it's the internal politics that has generated the radicalism and the discontent to begin with. In the U.S., I think for the most part, people tend to not pay attention to this. It's too complex, it's too confusing, and in many cases there is a sense that we have already given so much, both in terms of money, in terms of lives, and I don't think there's really an understanding of that the real pain on the ground in these countries has been far greater and has been experienced far longer than the interventions. And I think it's hard for many Americans to believe that our own goodwill and good efforts could not lead to something positive and that could create even more disaster than it was intended to. But that seems to be what the case is. In the Arab Spring, I think the U.S., it's been actually kind of interesting to see the way the U.S. initially tried to hold back and not embrace the protests on the street. I mean, I think they were thinking that this was going to be a very brief episode, and then finally the Western leaders came out and they were cautioning against a sudden shift, seemingly continuing to support the authoritarian leaders until it became clear that things were going to change. And then they changed their rhetoric, and they began to promise a new openness to deal with the Middle East. But this promise has also kind of now disappeared. Given this situation, I don't think it's very surprising that the retrograde politics that has now reasserted itself in the Middle East, aside from Tunisia, is mirrored by the kind of retrograde politics of ISIS. They have attempted to do away with the idea of the modern Middle East, of modern nation states. I think this is just a symbolic effort to do this. Whether this is going to spread, I think that's kind of doubtful in some ways. I think the security concern, the counterterrorism concern is going to wind up tamping this down over time. But the frustration itself is not going to go away. And I think what these things are, I mean, the desperation of people looking to people like the return of the caliph, as if this is going to solve problems, is really more or less a genuflect to a kind of past that people are hoping for only because the present and the near future doesn't look very positive at all. People in the West often look at this region in turmoil and attribute this condition to Islam and to the unwillingness of Muslims in the Middle East to condemn extremism. But the history of religious extremism in the region is linked to the history of political extremism. And Western politics and Western intervention are part of this history. Moreover, extremism itself has been politicized, made part of the regional government's attempts to neutralize the opposition and or create a sense of fear to provide the state with a mandate to act with impunity towards identified threats, whether they're real or imagined. Witness the current crackdown on the Muslim Brothers in Egypt and the concerted effort of a number of countries to eliminate a movement that was once considered a standard bearer of Islam in the modern world. Witness also the duplicitous behavior of Western governments as they gloss over the human rights abuses of regional governments, including actions against the Muslim Brotherhood, and support once again authoritarian rulers. It's little wonder that Muslims in the region and beyond, especially the young, have grown frustrated, cynical, and angry. How are they supposed to intellectually process the times in which they live? And what answers can religious leaders provide? Is it responsible to preach that Islam calls for moderation when life around them seems to be driven by extremes, the extremes of jihadism and the extremes of illegitimate states? Is it responsible to advocate a moderate politics in the face of authoritarian rulers? For to do so is to essentially encourage political passivity. For all the perversity that informs IS ideology and violence, it is inviting Muslims to participate, to engage in shaping a future, even if it is a future that seems to promise more death than life. And until regional and world powers decide to put as much effort into transforming the political and economic conditions of people as they do in policing them through security and counterterrorism measures, we are likely to see more people take up the invitation to join the global jihad. I'll stop there.